even though there were no tests done inside the walls, the tested material clearly relate to the occupations of the three major plazas within the Pueblo itself, which gave us an opportunity to not only get a nice new modern sample, which was sorely needed, but also to determine whether we could verify the hypothesized projection of the construction and usage of those plazas, which basically should be South Plaza, North Plaza, East Plaza, in that order, although not necessarily exclusively, right? Because people go on occupying one part of the village while they build another part as well. But that sort of a sequence is something that we tried to verify, and I think I can show you that we did. If you want more detail on this same project, take a look at Pottery Southwest. It's online, and I wrote an article covering the same basic project and our conclusions from it in Pottery Southwest, Spring Summer 2019. It's volume 35, numbers 1 and 2. Let's start with some general geography. Archaeologists refer to the Middle Rio Grande region, or also called the Rio Medio by Marshall and Walt, the Tiwa province, and in general, it's south of the Tiwa district, up around Bandelier, and it's north of the Piro province to the south. So essentially, we're looking at, where you are, right? Bernalillo, basically right in here, is at the northern end of the Middle Rio Grande region. Albuquerque Basin is, of course, part of that. And then south to Los Lunas and to an undefined boundary somewhere around Santa Acacia, certainly north of Socorro. And you'll notice on the screen, there's a town called Google there at the bottom. Right. Sorry, that came along for the ride. Okay, so that's in general the Middle Rio Grande. The area corresponds not only geographically, but culturally to the area occupied traditionally long-term by the Tiwa people, the Tiwa province as it was called by the Spanish, and blends at some point to the Piros on the south, and probably more dramatically to the, first of all, to the Caras and then the Tiwa provinces farther north. In case you don't think there are any archaeological sites around Albuquerque, this is what the ARMS map looks like, which I have access to NPS ARMS data. And I don't have any of the LA numbers on here, so it doesn't really matter. But although the urban spread of Albuquerque has, of course, wiped out a great deal of archaeological materials in the past, it is interesting to see how many little red dots are actually on this map. All of these are recorded LA number sites. And so here's sort of downtown Albuquerque. There's nothing left there, but in all of the peripheral areas in the suburbs, and of course some of these sites no longer exist as well, unfortunately. In the foothills area, the Forest Service region has preserved a number of very interesting foothills sites which are peripheral to some of the major pueblos that existed down here along the river. So we not only have the big pueblos such as Kuaua, Piedras Marcadas, Chamizal, and many others, but there are other sites going back to the Archaic and even Paleo-Indian times on the West Mesa, and especially concentrated in the arroyos, such as the Tijeras Arroyo drainage. John Guth there will recognize that concentration because we visited quite a number of those sites in the past few years. A quick reminder about the chronological stages. The traditional Pecos classification, of course, for the ceramic period would start somewhere in here. We don't know when ceramics first were made in the Middle Rio Grande area. I'm guessing probably 600, 700 AD. It's not well documented or well dated, but certainly by 800 and 900, there are major pit house villages in the area. which, if you're looking at this chronology, would put us into Pueblo 1, and Pueblo 2 became quite active. This was all subsumed by Windorf and Reed in 1955 in the developmental stage. Although this is used quite a lot these days, I have certain reservations about it. The coalition period very definitely needs to start earlier than 1200. If you go by what the definition of the coalition period is, it's probably about 1130 or 1150 in start time. You know, the classic Bonito phase at Chaco Canyon pretty much ended by 1125, 1150, and that was a major shakeup time period throughout New Mexico. And it had a lot of repercussions everywhere, and including the Albuquerque area. And major changes occurred, I think, sooner than 1200. My preference would be to put that line down in here. In any case, be aware that there are two ways of looking at the chronology. And of course, we're talking about the classic Pueblo time period, starting as early as 1300 and certainly going strong by 1325. You'll find different dates right in here when black and white pottery gave way to glazeware pottery, and the huge classic period sites such as the one at Kuaua were built. We're talking about certainly 1325. We don't have a lot of coalition pottery actually at Kuaua, and I don't think it was really going full speed until probably 1325, although there are coalition pit house villages very close by. In fact, part of one was excavated just a year ago due to the expansion of the roadway right there near the campground. And in fact, in the campground, you can't see it today, but there was a pit house village recorded in the 1970s. So the remnants of the coalition period are very much around us, although because occupation was in pit house villages, they don't stand out very well. And many of them have been disturbed intentionally or unintentionally by developments in the area, pretty much wiped out. That particular phase, the coalition, had black and white pottery. You probably recognize some of this stuff. It occurs occasionally, even in the classic period, but was replaced very, very rapidly about 1325 by Rio Grande Glazeware, which of course is all over the place at places like Kuaua and probably 3 or 4 other major pueblos in the Albuquerque area, in less states of repair, unfortunately, than Kuaua. These include Red Mesa black on white, Puerco Escovada black on white, and Gallup black on white are typical. Just remember black on white. There you go. And some of the pit house villages that were recorded basically as salvage operations right in front of the bulldozers contained much of this kind of pottery. The Denison site that Gordon Vivian and Clendenin recorded, the Cedillo site by Skinner, the artificial leg sites by Frisbee, all are examples of sites in the Albuquerque area that basically no longer exist, but they were pit house villages and contained Cibola whiteware of this general type. Moving a little bit later in time, and just before Kuaua was constructed, 1200 to 1325, Socorro black on white became very popular, also a Cibola whiteware, and then a transition from mineral painting into carbon painted pottery. Santa Fe black on white is sort of the granddaddy and last big gasp of black on white pottery, not only in the Santa Fe area, but also made and used in the Albuquerque area. And although it's hard for you to see, the mineral paint that was used prior to that in Socorro black on white gave way to this sort of washy, coal black, indistinct line carbon paint that I think probably came into the area via Santa Fe black on white, which was a major type throughout the area, including Santa Fe and Albuquerque. This is one of Mike Marshall's maps. He's got several very good ones for different time periods, just to give you an idea of the number of major named and numbered pueblos that exist right here in the Albuquerque area. There we go, Kuaua, LA 187. Santiago across the way, Santiago North, and the other ones that he's recorded in here are all or were extensive P4 pueblos. Puarai, Chamisal I've worked at. Let's see, what else does he have down here? The Man site, 290, also called Piedras Marcadas, which I analyzed pottery from. Many of these pueblos essentially no longer exist as structures, although there are collections from some of them stored in the museum and are still available. So of course the insidious spread of Albuquerque and its suburbs have essentially wiped out most of the black dots that you see on this screen. Castañeda, the chronicler of the Coronado expedition, according to my friend Dave Snow, recorded 16 major pueblos between Isleta and Bernalillo, in other words, in the Albuquerque region. And we think that he may have missed a couple of them. So let's say that there were 18 major pueblos in 1540, roughly, at that time. If you multiply each one of those by 1,000 people, you've got a population of what, 18,000 to 20,000 people living in the middle Rio Grande, Albuquerque area specifically at that time. There was a very large population here. Okay, now looking at Kuaua specifically, this is what it looks like today, of course. And you can distinctly see the kivas that have been excavated, 5, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in all, and the plazas south, north, and east, hypothetically constructed in that order. Clay Mathers initially found his Coronado period metal artifacts in this area, although I think he has since identified them in a wider area around. But if there was an attack on the Pueblo at some level of intensity, it was believed to be here. And I'll come back to that because that's very interesting, because it ties very nicely with the pottery in this area, which we can't date specifically, of course, as tightly as you can metal artifacts, but 1540, 1541 fits very nicely with the Glaze D and early Glaze E pottery that dominate the rooms in this particular suite in this plaza. So it's always nice when things tie together like that. This is a picture of the ruins of Kuaua in roughly, I think it's 1940. There were some aerial flights and aerial photographs taken, I think, by Gordon Vivian, and I've forgotten the guy who piloted the plane. But they flew Kuaua, and they flew neighboring Santiago. Another view in the early 40s. These pictures are actually available online, priceless as far as revealing not only the extent of the Pueblo, but how many rooms had been opened up. As you're probably aware, and it wouldn't be done this way today, a great many rooms, in fact, probably everyone they could get their hands on, were excavated rather rapidly in the late 30s because of the desire to get the Pueblo opened up and made impressive looking for the Quattrocentennial celebration of Coronado's arrival in 1940. It's kind of a shame that they did so much at once, because they didn't leave very much for modern techniques after that. This is the neighboring Pueblo, originally called Puarai. There was a confusion of one on the east side, one on the west side of the river. This is Bandelier's Puarai, more commonly known today as Santiago Pueblo, LA 326. It was kind of the companion to Kuaua and lies only about 2.5, 3 miles away to the south. Very little of this Pueblo exists anymore. It's been wiped out by modern construction, cement plant, dairy. There's a small portion of it, I think, over in this area that has been preserved. more recently by the Archaeological Conservancy and Santiago Pueblo. But the open rooms you see here, I think this is rather interesting. Those were excavated also by UNM under the direction of Edgar Lee Hewitt. And I don't know how many rooms that encompasses, but it looks like 60, 70, 80 rooms in a kiva, which we know very little about because, to my knowledge, nobody has ever analyzed the material that came out of this. It's lurking somewhere in UNM's Maxwell Museum basement. I have to throw this in. These are actually Spanish period metal artifacts from Piedras Marcadas, which I had access to this picture. It actually comes from Matt Schmader's work to the south at LA 290, Piedras Marcadas. That site has been preserved by the city. It's on the west side next to their visitor center, the open air visitor center. It's surrounded by a big fence, but you can still see a lot of that Pueblo. It hasn't all been preserved, but a major part of it has been, fortunately. And of course, more recently, items like this have been found at Kuaua by Clay Mathers, as you've heard. We have to mention classic period iconography, rock art. There's a warrior with a spear. Things were getting tough and competitive in Pueblo 4 times in classic period times. We don't know precisely how, but warfare was not uncommon. This guy right here is a what? He's a rattlesnake, right? But he's not a feathered serpent. He's a horned serpent. And I'm not an expert on rock art, but Dave Snow will tell you that feathered serpents as such don't really exist up here, that the iconography of the rock art in this area really has to do with the horned serpent rather than the feathered one. And this guy is somebody who came down from space and he's got some antennas on, so maybe that happened too. Okay, on to Kuaua. The plan view of the site includes over 900 ground floor rooms, unknown second story rooms, perhaps a total of 1,200 rooms in all, including 6 kivas, a massive site. And again, consisting of 3 major plazas with kivas unevenly spread throughout. Major excavations have occurred predominantly in the South Plaza, to some extent in the North Plaza, and actually we know very little about the East Plaza, partly because it was disturbed by the construction of the house now used as the office. In 2017, the testing that was done consisted of test units as abbreviated as TU and auger units, which ran out from there laterally away from the boundaries of the site in order to assess the extent of artifactual materials out and around the site itself. As I said, even though we didn't obtain any material from within the house boundaries, we do have a large number of TUs in particular, which gave us over 2,000 pieces of pottery, and we were able to determine with the spread of the TUs as they were arranged, something about the construction sequence of the site based on the pottery in those TUs. So again, the purpose of the 2017 test was to collect the first, believe it or not, unbiased artifact samples, 100% screened with modern techniques. Hadn't happened before, believe it or not. A lot of the material that we had and the information we have from Kuaua up to this point was obtained a long time ago in the 1930s or earlier, going back to the 20s even. So it was very important that we acquire some newer material with modern techniques and screens. We wanted to determine, as I said, the spatial extent of artifacts around the site perimeter, and to look at the south, north, and east plazas as separate units. Now, Matt and others, you may correct me on this, but there are very few actual absolute dates in print. There was at 2017 a 1397 date on the South Plaza. There are 2 other dates that I know of since then, but my point is, and they're all basically fairly early. They're Glaze A type dates. One was obtained last year. Matt will correct me on this. I'm going to say late 1300s. But the point is that there are very few, unfortunately, absolute dates or datable materials for a site of this size.
Hayward, that date was actually early 1300s or late 1200s.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
So it's Coalition Classic,
right?
End of Coalition, early Classic.
Yeah, I've got it written down someplace. But we don't have any chronometric absolute dates for stuff that's later on, which would be great to obtain. You know what I mean? In other words, 1500s, 1600s. As far as I know, we don't have good absolute dates for that time period, although we've obviously got occupation going on and we've got pottery. So yeah, for a site this size, I think we have very few dates to help us out. Everybody thinks that pottery has dates attached to it. I've held up a lot of potsherds and I don't see any dates on them. How is pottery dated? By association with absolute dated materials or stratigraphic deposits, and that's how we get these date ranges. And luckily pottery changes very fast. We like that. Styles change rapidly every 25 to 50 years, and that helps us in a relative way, but in an absolute way, we're still dependent on association with absolute materials in order to get these dates pinned down. It was hard work, but the screening and the collection methodology was totally modern. And again, that marks a departure from everything prior to that. We're not going to bore you with a lot of pottery types here, but basically the glazeware sequence goes from A through F and can be conveniently grouped into three major groups: A and B, C and D, and E and F. If you join our pottery crew, we'll give you a lot more information on that. But these are just examples. Here's a nice Glaze A bowl. It's actually Los Padillas glazed polychrome. That particular vessel is probably from Tiwa-speaking Pueblo. And the transition to a polychrome, brightly colored pottery from black and white was rather drastic, very rapid, and was probably in response to people moving into the region from probably the Little Colorado River, and bringing the White Mountain redwares with them, which inspired the local potters to make a transition from black on white pottery to what we call polychrome pottery, and also the start of the use of glazed paint. In the middle, C and D exhibit a much broader, bolder style. As you can see here, they're often styled animal forms, including often birds. This is probably a parrot down here. The paint and application becomes somewhat more sloppy as time goes on, but that didn't seem to inhibit anybody from, and as a matter of fact, the individual expression and the use of animals and even human forms becomes much more pronounced through time. Whereas initially in Glaze A, everything was pretty strict, buttoned up tight, and geometric. Much more free form occurs later on. Luckily, the types have been more or less well dated elsewhere, and we can use those types cross-dated at Kuaua to determine in any given room or plaza approximately when it was in use. Here are some examples that showed up during analysis. Here's a fairly early piece. Here's one of these exposed coil things. We published an article several years ago, last year, on the exposed coils, which turn up and we don't know what they were used for at several classic period sites. Just some examples of, these would be Glaze C and D. Here are jars, excuse me, a later bowl, Glaze F. And these particular streaks that you see here are actually Rennie glaze paint that ran towards the rim. That confirms, by the way, that this pottery was fired upside down, inverted, because when it ran, which was an unfortunately very common mistake during the late Glazes E and F, you notice the bubbles and so forth. The picture's not real large, but the runniness is a feature of glaze E and F, and sometimes it ran clear over to the rim during the firing process. We don't know why, and it's been talked about many times, why the nice, neat geometric patterns and well-controlled paint of glaze A ended up, in our eyes anyway, a rather sloppy application and poorly fired. I have an article that I'm going to hopefully get out one of these days on the firing process, which I think was part of the issue with the late glazes. I think not only did the glaze material maybe alter, but that they lost control of the firing process, which was done outside, no kilns. I want you to look at this guy right here. I think he's a horse. There's a head there and some spots. Maybe it's an Appaloosa. Could that happen? Certainly, with glaze F, right? After 1600, you have Spanish, you have horses. And if this is a depiction of the horse, that could certainly occur on the very late glazes. Hi guys, I miss you, my crew. Hopefully we'll be able to get back together in the future when we're not separated by coronavirus. Now I hope you're taking notes for the quiz. I'm going to go through this very briefly. This type of chart is what we base the dates on. And again, we shouldn't declare that this is hard and fast because there's a lot of wiggle room here. But essentially the glazes, as I mentioned, are graded, and this was done by Harry Mera many years ago, and before that, Kidder at Pecos and Anna Shepard ordered them in much the same way, only they used numbers instead of letters. So this sequence is fairly well established. We can't date things to the date, but I think we've got the changes down to a roughly 25-year period. And so when we find, and there's a lot of this at Kuaua, glaze D and E, we can give you an idea of when that room, let's say, was occupied within, on a good day, within 25 years. Now, unfortunately, this sequence was based on glazeware bowl rims only, and that's because they changed very rapidly. What about all the other pottery? The bowl body sherds or the jars cannot be as precisely dated, at least at this time. But the crew has been very good in grading them at least into 3 major time zones: early, intermediate, and late, based on the decoration. So if we have a bowl rim, we can get quite close. If we have any other part, we can't get that precise, but at least we can give it an early, intermediate, or late assignment. We also have some pottery, although maybe surprisingly not very much, that comes from other areas outside of the glazeware manufacturing zone. Glazeware, by the way, was manufactured all throughout the major pueblos that we mentioned, up and down the Rio Grande and over to Tonke, the Galisteo Basin, San Marcos, and so forth. So it was a big zone making glazeware pottery. Not all of it was necessarily made at Kuaua. And that's an interesting thing, because we need to be able to distinguish the glazeware pottery that was made locally versus that was made, for example, at San Marcos, where Carrie Schler has done a lot of work. But the other intrusives, the other non-local pottery that stand out like a sore thumb that's not glazeware, are not very many, as a matter of fact. We have the biscuitware. You probably are familiar with Abiquiu and Bandolier, black on white. Where does that come from? To the north, okay? The Proto-Tewa area, Bandolier. We had, I think, one Hopi sherd. There has been, since, a couple of black on white sherds from the Jemez, although that's surprisingly rare. We don't have large amounts of intrusive pottery from outside the Glazeware Middle Grande area. And don't forget the utility stuff. All I can say is about that is plain surfaced utility ware was predominant during the Glazeware period, although prior to that, corrugated was the norm back in coalition black on white times. And we see at Kuaua a change. There is some corrugated still being made. We don't have a good date on it, but I'm thinking that by 1400, maybe 1425, corrugated pottery had completely given way to plain surface grayware with no corrugations left on it. With that in mind, here is the actual counts that came from the work that we did. Let's see, 2,206 sherds. These are the bowl rims that we love so much, although of course the sample sizes are not as large as we would ultimately like. And that's why we're also looking at the bowl bodies and jar sherds that give us, at least generically, an early, intermediate, and late assignment. One thing to notice really is that there's pottery of all these time periods. A lot of Glaze A, and that's true everywhere, Glaze A and B. C and D also very prominent at Kuaua. What happens in Glaze F times, and we've noticed this elsewhere, is the numbers drop off. Glaze F is essentially 1600 and later. And I think that a diminished population, and this probably goes for the Jemez at Gisua, as well as here and at other contemporary pueblos of the early Spanish period, I think the population was going down. And I think that's reflected in the smaller numbers of potsherds that we have in the Glaze F period. Even though these numbers are not great, you can see a huge difference between Glaze D and E versus Glaze F, which has very few identifiable sherds. So for whatever reason, and I think it was a time of great stress in the Pueblos, and not as much Glaze F shows up anywhere as the prior types. And again, as I mentioned, we have just a little bit of Hopi pottery, a tiny bit of Biscuit A and Biscuit B from up north, and the utility wares. So what did we derive from all of this? The glazeware is present from earliest to latest. We don't see any gaps in the occupation of Kuaua as such. It was in not necessarily full-blown occupation at all times, but there were people living there from at least 1325 until undoubtedly the revolt of 1680. The site was never abandoned, although different parts of it were constructed at different times. So within that overall time period, the early glazes, and this is also very common in the area, are the most predominant numerically, followed by the intermediate, and then, as I mentioned, the late glaze types, which if pottery equals people, and it must to some extent, if the number of sherds goes way down, the number of pots went down. The number of pots went down, why? There are probably fewer people, and certainly in Glaze F times, a stressed population, and perhaps even a diseased population. And we do have, as I mentioned, some imports from outside the glazeware region, the biscuitware and the Hopi wares, but surprisingly small, actually. So here's a pie chart showing the overall entire 2,000 sherd sample. And the early glazes occupy at least 50% of that, the intermediate and the late glazes, E and F, but F itself, although I don't have it separately here, would only be a quite small slice. Okay, finally, we also tried to separate out the parts of the sample that came from different parts of the site. And if you imagine going around the site from the parking lot over to the west and then to the north and then around that way. So we got the South Plaza first. South Plaza south side would be where the parking lot is, okay? South Plaza west side is around the corner and going north. And then we've got the North Plaza, of course, on the west side. And then if you bend around the top, you got the North Plaza north side. And then, although there wasn't a lot of collection going on, we do have a few sherds from what I call the northeast side. I don't think the East Plaza was heavily sampled in this project. If you take the numbers that are in the total column by group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which are basically going around the site in that way, and graph them, so it's a little bit easier to see, the pattern is fairly clear, especially between the South Plaza and the North Plaza. This is the total amount of pottery. South Plaza wins, right? A lot of pottery, and it's dominated by glaze A and B. Secondarily, I mean, because people don't totally abandon one area of the site. Well, in some cases they do. I mean, there are parts of Acoma Pueblo that are no longer used at all. There are parts of the Hopi villages that are no longer being occupied. But presumably, there were some residents still in, for example, the South Plaza as the North Plaza was being built, and possibly even after that. So essentially, it's a trend rather than a complete replacement. But very clearly, the early glazes are dominant in group 1, which is the South Plaza south side and the parking lot, and the South Plaza west side is here, where the totals are not the same. That's just due to collection vagaries. But basically, if you look at the pattern here, it's the same as that. Dominated by glazes A and B, and much less C and D and E and F. When we get to the North Plaza in group 3, that's changed a lot. A might have a long period of time anyway. A and B is still here. You're never going to get rid of glaze A, they say. C and D, of course, but a much stronger showing of glazes E and F. So this is the North Plaza west side. And then wrapping around the top, the samples got a lot smaller, but relatively speaking, I think you can see we still have all three represented, and I'd like to see those numbers ideally pop up here so we could have a better percentage with them. But they kind of look like, overall, if you just look at the pattern here, not that different from the North Plaza. It would be great to have much better samples from that area of the site, which is presumably quite late and possibly not even completed in construction. I would expect them to be dominated by glaze E and F if we were to actually obtain larger and better samples from that area of the site. But at least you can see the pattern that exists there. Okay, so to wrap this up, the first thing that we found was glazeware pottery everywhere in the site, all areas of the site. Every TU and every AU yielded multiple potsherds. There was no test anywhere that didn't have pottery in it. And 2,000 sherds was a pretty good sample to work with. The pottery types are, as we expected, almost entirely Rio Grande Glazeware, which would be typical for the production zone that Kuaua is in for this region in time, because it was part of a bigger sphere, a regional interaction network, which obtained glazed materials probably from the Cerrillos Hills, possibly via San Marcos Pueblo, and then those paint materials were distributed throughout the middle Rio Grande, and people made glazeware pottery locally using some of these paint pigments that were actually imported from the Cerrillos. What that says, at least, is there was a lot of interaction, a lot of trade, and these folks were in contact with each other during the Classic period almost continuously. So the pottery types were not unexpected. The range of ceramic dates, based on what we know from the pottery dates and the few absolute dates, certainly go all the way through, from 1300 possibly to the revolt of 1680, but definitely to 1650. And that gives us essentially a continuous occupation time period for Kuaua of over 300 years. Number 4, quantities of early glazes always exceed, and this is quite common in these types of sites, If pottery equals people, there were a lot of potters making a lot of pottery during Glaze A and B up until at least 1450. And, you know, I think there was a definite local population, but I think there was also probably an influx of population from other areas, probably from the western pueblos to the south, from the Little Colorado region, St. John's Polychrome area, which had imported pottery to this area for a long time, I think set a lot of people up here for whatever reason. That's certainly the interpretation also at big sites such as Pottery Mound. So I think there was a local population that was augmented by a population influx also at some time between 1300, 1325, because certainly, and the technology, everything changed, right? We're not doing pit houses anymore. We're doing large pueblos, and the population, if we have it right, certainly to me exceeded what could have been accounted for by the pit house villages of the coalition and late developmental periods prior to that. As we just pointed out, the frequencies of the ceramics around the perimeter changed from the South Plaza to the North Plaza to the East Plaza in terms of date as predicted. Again, we're not as good as Clay Mathers in dating stuff precisely to the year, but we can make pretty good stab at it. And these units were probably built and occupied in that sequence without necessarily abandonments of the other plazas. The South Plaza was the biggie, and certainly goes A through C and maybe never quits. But in terms of dominance, the North Plaza became much more active after that. And then the East Plaza, although we don't have a great sample, became built and occupied, I think, thereafter. We don't have a good handle on whether the old room blocks were abandoned as the village grew. And with a whole lot more absolute chronometric dates, we might be able to actually determine that. So the village grew, and yet, as far as we can tell ceramically, people didn't necessarily move out of the older plazas. The South Plaza was probably continuously occupied to some extent all the way through. In fact, was reoccupied in the South unit at the end. We have a lot of questions that remain. I wanted to also mention that, I can go back, Clay Mathers' initial finds, and he may have added on to this since I listened to his talk recently, the metal artifacts, including crossbow bolts, bolt heads, and so forth, that implied military activity, I think he said centered in this area, up in here. And that's very interesting, because we had already determined that the North Plaza, pottery-wise, was late Glaze D and E, and that fit very nicely with a 1540, 1541 absolute date on Coronado's incident here. Clay may have also expanded his finds, but if that was the focal point for the interaction, whatever kind of attack or siege it was, that makes perfect sense with the pottery, since we know from the ceramics that this area was pretty densely occupied at that particular time. So it's kind of nice when those two lines of evidence come together.
I have a question.
Hi, sure.
And thank you so much for doing this and having it recorded. I think it's going to be a really valuable part of our training. My question is about galena, which I believe contains a lead content, and at some point was used in the glazing and produced a shiny finish. Is that true? And was it much desired during some period? And did it also produce a messier appearance when fired?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Thank you.
That's right. The Rio Grande Glazeware was painted, just the black paint now, not the slips and not the red, but just the black paint. Starting in as early as 1300, was a mineral-based paint. Now, mineral-based paints were not that unusual to Pueblo potters because they had been using, well, if you go back to Socorro black on white, for example, in the same area, that was a mineral paint. Glazeware paints are just a specific kind of mineral paint. And with some experimentation, it was discovered that the galena ore that's available actually several places in the region, but particularly in the Cerrillos Hills, made a very nice paint if it was pulverized. It needs to be made into a pigment, right? So you can apply it on the surface and probably mixed with Rocky Mountain beeweed as a carrier, so you can actually have a liquid. You've all done painting, of course. You can't just paint galena ore on a pot. You've got to make it into a suitable liquid pigment. But that mixture was applied, and then of course during the heat process of firing, it turned shiny. And I think folks liked that result. And they went for this 120% starting in Glaze A, and there was some very beautiful pottery made with glaze paints that were quite well controlled, as you saw in that picture of the red vessel at the beginning, Glaze A. But through time, something happened. The glaze paints became runnier and also discolored. They're not even black in many cases. They're brownish, they're greenish. They've got bubbles, they've got sags and runs. So, and hey, maybe people liked it that way. Maybe we shouldn't apply our our modern, rather critical rules on this, but at least to our eyes, something happened to cause the decline and fall of Rio Grande Glazeware, so that by the time you have Glaze E and F, the paints are not well controlled. Now, maybe people thought that was beautiful. Let me point this out. You guys are old enough that you remember, and maybe you did this yourself. Did you ever make pottery back in the 70s or early 80s? Because handmade pottery, wheel-made pottery was very popular in the US. People were throwing pots and making vases and candelabras and all kinds of stuff on wheels and firing it in their kilns. And guess what was really popular? Really runny glaze slips. Do you remember that? They had big drip marks coming down the side, and all my hippie friends thought that was really cool. I don't think it's so pretty anymore, but standards change. And that's why I'm saying, the decline and fall of Rio Grande Glazeware doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We don't know what people thought about their pottery. Glazeware was not made after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. It's as if in those 12 years, people just dropped the whole thing. The whole technique was never revived after that. And so historic potters, I mean, the whole historic matte painted pottery that you're familiar with today, at Acoma and Zia and potters still making huge amounts of pottery, it's all matte painted. Nobody's used glazes since 1700, probably 1680. And so the technique was lost. And potters, after that very disruptive time, never attempted to really make glaze. I should take it back. There's some evidence in the downtown plaza in Santa Fe that a few potters were still hanging around in 1700-ish after the Reconquest, still perhaps making glazeware, but to all intents and purposes, glazeware was stopped with the Pueblo Revolt. And since potters in modern times among the Pueblos have not revived it, we are only using our guesswork as to how it was actually made and created. So yeah, the late glazes, you're absolutely right. It's really kind of amazing, I think, that people who made pottery so beautifully and excellently several hundred years prior to that had seemed to lose, apparently, some of the techniques that their great-great-grandparents knew about. That's very unusual that a technology like that would show a downturn, especially among the Pueblos to whom pottery is such an important craft art. So am I answering your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Hayward, I have a question about the glaze itself. Having been a potter a couple of times in my life, glazes are typically lead or some kind of a metal that is mixed in with the silicates to create and then it melts and makes a shiny thing. So if they used lead, is there any evidence anywhere that that people suffered from having mined the lead or
I've heard
anything like that?
this question before. It's possible that if you were mining lead, you got exposed to it fairly often. In terms of usage of the pottery, I think we're all familiar with the warnings that people gave us about Mexican lead-based slips and paints that, you shouldn't cook with them or whatever. That may be true, but remember, okay, my answer to your question is I don't think anybody was affected by lead poisoning in the use of this pottery. For one thing, the glazes are only used on what kind of pottery? Serving dishes. They didn't cook in them. Cooking was done in utility ware, right? So you're not exposing it to huge amounts of heat, definitely not over a fire. You wouldn't take this beautiful bowl and expose it to the kinds of wear and tear you get on a fire anyway. So these were serving dishes. These were, Sunday best. So, and a second factor is that the amount of surface covered by the glazed paint is actually fairly small. Okay, most of the surface of the pot is slip. All the red parts are paint. If you see a typical design, if you can remember what they look like, often there are these angular fret areas that are red panels and they're outlined by glazed paint. But consider how much of the vessel surface is actually occupied by glazed paint. Not very much. So for both reasons, because they weren't cooking in it and because they were only serving maybe lukewarm by that point dishes, and because the amount of glaze percentage-wise doesn't cover that much of the vessel, I'm very doubtful that people got exposed as users, at least, to excessive amounts of lead. If people were up there at the Bathsheba mine in the Cerritos Hills and they're mining this stuff, I think that's maybe a different story, and I don't know. Does anybody know, Matt? Have there been studies of the amount of lead osteologically that got into people's systems or in their bones?
You're talking about in New Mexico?
Yeah. Do we know?
I don't know. The only thing I can tell you is that, remember Europeans, now not so much with the Spanish, but remember with Europeans, like on the East Coast, Europeans ate off pewter dishes.
Yeah.
Those were a lot worse for you than like Pueblo dishes. If you want to do a comparison as to how much lead and junk you're putting in your system, it's a lot worse on the East Coast.
Right. Let's see. Pewter is a mixture of lead and tin, I believe.
Yeah.
And that probably exposed you to a lot more lead than the paints on glazeware bowls out here.
Well, also,
but I don't know of any tests osteologically that have verified that. I doubt that really was any kind of a major factor.
Well, I knew that that the lead used on the bowls wasn't enough to actually hurt you. It's not so much the heat that causes the lead to be released as it is acids.
Acids.
Yeah, and
right.
So one of the reasons why the Romans had such a problem with lead was they had a lot of lead pipes and things, but they were also storing their wine in it.
Traditional diets consist of corned beans and squash, right? Until you get chili, and that's not acid enough to do very much to a lead line. I don't think it's not acid. So it's a pretty bland diet, basically. It's a good question, and I've heard this before. And my answer, for whatever it's worth, is I don't think that they had a lot of lead exposure, but that should be proven with tests osteologically, nor do I think that the diet had enough acid in it to even begin to leach out the lead that was in those paints. But it's an interesting question. And since, one thing that really bothers us as pottery folks is the lack of information that modern Pueblo potters can give us about the whole process of collecting, mining, production of glazed pigments, and the application, and what I'm looking at is the firing of glazed paintwares, because the technique was apparently completely lost to the point where potters after the Reconquest basically couldn't duplicate or didn't want to the late prehistoric stuff that their ancestors not so long before had been making. That a completely lost art.
Can I ask
Of
a
course.
question?
Yeah.
Did you catalog the motifs that you were finding on the pottery? For example, you identified one as a horned serpent, and then you identified what you thought was a horse. Did you do any cataloging of those?
No, basically we did what you might call gross typology, because we wanted some real basic information on how much of glaze A, B, C, D. So, I mean, we were interested in time here more than any other thing. And secondarily, we were interested in the plazas, right? But obviously that doesn't exhaust what you can learn from the pottery. We also recorded vessel forms, and I haven't come up with any data on that, but it's there. I have yet to come up with how many bowls and how many jars, and basically there were not a lot of vessel forms in the classic period times. This potsherd comes from Pottery Mound, and it's my favorite potsherd. I do have a favorite potsherd. It's a beautiful piece of Pottery Mound polychrome, and it has black glazed paint, as you can see right here, but it also has numerous other colors that contributed to the overall design.
Raise it up, Hayward, a little bit.
Yeah, yes, yes.
There are 4 colors on the interior and 3 colors on the exterior, and only the black parts are actually glazed paint. But they learn to paint with white, slip with white, paint with red, slip with red. The number of different combinations that potters could come up with at Pottery Mound was almost infinite. And the site is well named because of that. The potters, this is contemporary with Glaze at the early period at Kuaua, were incredibly creative in producing pottery that looked like this. So, I mean, the glazed paint is only part of the overall design, of course. So, the creativity that went into the production of this stuff is really quite amazing. And yes, absolutely, we need to study the design elements. There are people who've done this. Suzanne Eckert has done studies at Tonke and also at Pottery Mound of the designs. It's very difficult to do that with potsherds, right? You need substantial parts of the vessel to do that with. Actually, I like potsherds better than whole pots because they're already broken and we can look at the paste and the temper inside without having to bust up whole vessels. It's really convenient that way. So I never met a potsherd I didn't like. I like some more than others. But yes, unfortunately, given the physics of breakage, pots are very fragile, right? We all know that. But once pottery gets broken down to a certain size, and I'm just going to say 3 inches by 2 inches, you'll notice that it doesn't really break beyond that unless you run over it with a bulldozer or something. So that potsherds are actually, believe it or not, a fairly standard size. I mean, it's going to differ depending on the preservation conditions at different sites, but it's surprisingly uniform. Pottery breaks down to a certain point, and then the physics of it say it's not going to break much farther unless you really pulverize it. So that makes potsherds a fairly standard unit of measurement, a fairly standard unit of analysis, but it's not very good for analyzing the overall design work and design layout of this vessel because I don't have the other sherds that go with it. And putting sherds together is really tedious stuff. People spent hours smelling Duco cement years ago putting together pottery vessels. If we had, and we do have some partial reconstructions in the Maxwell Museum that I have not looked at, but those would be suitable for doing the kind of analysis that you're talking about. Design, layout. It's really interesting because all that changed as well in the 1300s. The designs, although some of it carried over into Glaze, certainly that black on red thing, if it weren't black on red, if it were black on white, it would fit very nicely into Santa Fe black on white or Socorro black on white. So not everything changed, but the bright colors and the polychrome thing just really took over. It just absolutely obliterated black on white pottery in this area.
Franklin, thank you so much. We're running out of time.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And yeah, we went over, but that's all right. I'd like to thank you for coming, and I'm glad that you were agreeable to our recording it, because we post this on kuaua.org, and we let all of our members hear it if they'd like, and also people that come from outside of our jurisdiction, and then they discover these things. So it's all good. Hopefully it builds some membership for us as well.
Thank you for this series, and thanks particularly to Matt for keeping this thing going, and Sherry and others who have allowed us to stay in touch and also to share data and information this way. I'm looking forward to getting back together someday with my pottery crew. I think we're all going to have to be retrained again if that ever happens. But, we're doing the best we can in an isolated condition here, and it's difficult for everybody, I know. So I hope all of you are staying healthy, and we'll get together again in person when that's possible.
All right.